So TIF versus TID. Again, just starting with the real basics, what's the difference, right? TIF, tax incremental financing, is really just think of it as the tool for development projects, and TID is the actual physical geographical area in which that happens. You can see the kind of the picture of what would be our TID number 4 in blue on the bottom right there. So what is tax incremental financing? It's Wisconsin's principal economic development financing tool for local governments. It was created in 1975. It's used to promote local tax base expansion by attracting new development and or eliminating blight. It also can be used for resource conservation and things. It doesn't happen as often as those two. So I kind of left it at that to keep it high level. Requires involvement from multiple taxing jurisdictions. That includes, of course, the municipality, would be the city, village, or town. There are a few towns that are allowed to create TIFs, or TIDs, I'm sorry. Not a ton at this point. That is being talked about in legislation right now. And of course, cities and villages are able to. In addition to the municipalities, the school district, the technical college, and the county are also involved. And then there's also a community member representative, which that is our joint review board. So important terms as we talk through this presentation: base value. So the definition of base value when we're talking TIDs, the total full market value of all property within the TID when that TID is created. And you'll see a visual in just a second. So if we were to create a TID in a month or 2 months, the base value would be the total property value at that time. Current value, the total full market value of all the property within the TID for the current year. So the current value would be the value maybe in year 5 of that TID. And then you compare that to the base value, which gives you the incremental or the increment value. And that's the difference between the base value and the current value of the TID. Tax increment, those are taxes foregone by overlapping taxing jurisdictions during the life of the TID. And that increment goes back into the TID. So that does not come back to the general tax base. That stays with the TID for the life of that TID, which I'll explain in a second as well. So how it works, and I'm not sure why it's kind of running off the screen there a little bit, but municipality expends funds to promote development or redevelopment. That results in development that generates increment within that TID, not back to the tax base, but within those boundaries for the life of the TID. Other taxing jurisdictions forego the increase in property tax revenue during that life of that TID. And then once the TID closes, it results in an increased tax base and property tax revenues to all taxing jurisdictions once that closes. So what does that look like in a visual? So we talked about that base value. Think of that blue line on the bottom. If we created that TID in a month or 2 months, at that time it would freeze for the life of the TID at whatever the value is at this point. And then if you think of the maroon there or purple as like a 15, well, let's think of it as a 20-year period, because we're going to be talking mixed use TIDs, and that's the maximum life of a mixed use TID. You can see at the beginning a kind of a slower escalation in TID increment that would be generated. There's kind of a growth period there in the middle, and then there's what they call the mature growth period at the end, where it steadily increases, and then the closure of that TID would be where the purple meets the gray, and that's when it would go onto the tax base for all of those taxing jurisdictions. And the argument is, of course, that if that's where the line is and that's where the new tax base is at that time in 20 years, it may be 30% of that if the TID wasn't created. That's the thought and the idea behind TIDs. Current statistics, thought I'd just run a couple statistics by you from the DOR. This comes from the 2021 TID manual. There are currently, according to that, 1,352 active TIDs in the state of Wisconsin. In 2020, the most recent data, there were 73 new TIDs certified. Of those 73, 32 were mixed use, and those are the two that we'll be talking about at our next meeting, the proposed TIDs 11 and 12. There were 18 rehabilitation and conservation TIDs, 16 blight elimination TIDs, and 7 industrial TIDs. I was actually a little surprised at the low number of industrial TIDs from that. But TID request by the year in 2020. So this is just a little bit of an interesting thing because we're not only going to be talking about the creation or the proposed creation of TIDs 11 and 12, which would match up with the 73 creations across the state in 2020. We're also going to be talking about a territory amendment, and that would be to TID number 8. We would be looking at amending the boundary to allow for the creation of TID 11 as proposed. And I'm not going to get into the details of all of that tonight. We will get into the details of that in 2 weeks when we go through the project plans, but just as it relates. 28 project plan amendments in 2020 throughout the state, 34 allocation amendments. That could be, TIDs switching what TIDs they donate to would be an example of that. 1 base value redetermination amendment and 55 extensions. So TID, this is an important question, and a question that needs to be answered when you create TIDs. So they call it the but-for test. I'm sure many of you have heard of this before, but this is a key component when you're looking at proposing the creation of TIDs. So would this, but for the use of TIF, tax increment financing, would the proposed development occur as proposed within the same time frame and with the same level of value? So just the visuals, kind of the question is if that TID was created, would it look like the bottom? And if the TID is not created in 20 years at the maximum life, would it look more like that top? And of course, we're not future tellers. You can't guarantee anything, but you go off of the information you have, and that's kind of the idea behind it. TID boundaries, so parcels must be continuous in order to be a part of a TID. You can't have an island. It all has to be connected in one way, shape, or form. Equalized valuation test, this is something you've heard us talk about over the last several months. One of the reasons we're talking about the potential creation of TID 11 and TID 12 is because we have dropped below the 12% of our equalized value that's in TIDs, and that happened because of the closure of our 3 TIDs at the end of 2021. And I'll get into that in a second as well. Must also meet any applicable test for the specific type of TID. I use the example of the specific thing that needs to be met for mixed use TIDs, again, because that's what we're going to be talking about next in 2 weeks. And that example is that in mixed use TIDs, no more than 35% can be newly platted residential. So you might say, okay, we've talked about River North. Why not just create that TID boundary around the exact River North area? Well, it's because 65% of it has to be not newly platted residential. Excuse me. So this is actually a map of what will be proposed in a couple weeks as far as a TID boundary for TID 11. Eligible project costs, public works and improvements, financing costs, real property assembly costs, professional service costs, administrative costs, relocation, organizational costs, prorated costs of utility infrastructure, cash grants, and environmental remediation are the eligible costs for TIDs. Financing options, just to simplify it, really, municipalities have a couple different options. You can pay for things up front, or you can pay as you go. 20 years ago, a lot of municipalities, it was the standard to go up front, and that has shifted to almost all municipalities and development agreements take the pay-as-you-go approach. That puts the risk more on the developer than it does on the municipality, and that is how we would plan to approach it, and actually how we plan to approach it with our current TIDs as well. So how is a TID created or approved? You guys have been updated on the process we've been going through. We've had the organizational meeting with the Joint Review Board. We have had the public hearing that is needed through Plan Commission. We have passed the resolutions through Plan Commission, and we are now in between that Plan Commission and the council time period. There needs to be 15 days that passes after that the public hearing at the Plan Commission meeting until council votes. And that 15 days is well past at this point, and will even more by the time we get to our next council meeting. And then City Council would vote to pass resolutions, and they would pass that along to the Joint Review Board, and the Joint Review Board would take final action. So you can kind of see, I just threw some logos up there of all of the jurisdictions, again, as I mentioned before, that are represented as a part of the Joint Review Board, and they would be making that final determination. It is worth noting that you can just see the general community member. The general community member that we have is works at a bank in town. Keith Snyder is the rep for that. Active Waupaca TIDs. So we're getting, we have less and less. It used to be that this was not too long ago, just a couple months ago, was 6 bullet points long, and now we're at 3. TID 4, which is at the Western Avenue, McDonald's area. TID 8, the East Gateway District. TID 10, which is Badger Street, a much smaller TID. Angelus Apartments, St. Mary's Church, Rec Center, that area. This is just a picture, a map of it, all of those TIDs, the active TIDs in relation to each other. So you can see on the east side there, TID 8, on the west side or western side, TID 4, and then TID 10 right there in the middle in orange. So just a little bit of information on our current TIDs. TID 4, the year it was created, it was 2000. The base value at that time was 2.9 million approximately. The current value is 32.9 million. That leaves us with an increment of just over 30 million. Expenditure period expiration, actually April of 2022. So I think it was April 22nd of 2022. So just a couple weeks ago was the end of the expiration period for that TID. There was not and has not been any conversations about a potential agreement that we missed out on or anything like that. So that's just good information for council to have. Estimated closure for TID 4, as it is a donor for TID 8, is 2032. TID 8, year was created 2001, base value of 1.7 million at the time, current value of 14.4 million. It's an increment of 12.6 million. Expenditure period expiration was 2019 for TID 8, and the estimated closure is 2032. Again, that they're going to work together. So if TID 8 closes, and let's say it somehow closes in 2030, TID 4 would close in 2030 as well. Just in speaking with Kathy, that 2032 date is an estimated growth within that TID, the increment within that TID of 3% per year. I know that over the last couple of years with the housing that's going up in the East Gateway, it has exceeded that. So hopefully we can get there faster, but right now we have 2032 as the dates. TID 10, that was created in 2001. Base value was 281,000 at the time. Current value 2.8 million with an increment of 2.6 million approximately. Expenditure period for that is coming up June 2023. A thing to keep in mind there, I know that St. Mary's Church has been sitting there for quite some time. Staff is continuing to work on that, and but that June 2023 date is something to keep in mind for that property specifically. Estimated closure for that TID is 2027. Yeah, go ahead, Mary.
I have a question. So can you explain what expenditure period expiration involves? So what is that?
Yeah, so we are no longer able to enter into development agreements after the expenditure period expires.
Okay.
So if we wanted to get into a development agreement, or if we felt like we had to get into a development agreement to do a specific project within that TID, we would have to do it before June of 2023. Does that help? Recently closed TIDs. So these are the ones I just mentioned before. At the end of 2021, City Council voted to close TID 3. That closed 2 years early. The max life on that was out to 2023. TID 6, the West Fulton Street TID, out by Foxfire on the very west side of town, that closed 6 years early. That had a max life of 2027. And TID 9, Royalton Street, there was I think it was one parcel, closed 2 years early. That had a max life of 2024. And then this is really just the last slide. Later this month or in 2 weeks at our next council meeting, we'll be having a discussion on these two TIDs. These are a map with and the circle you see around it is a half-mile radius. That is, you can have expenditures within that half-mile from the boundaries of the TIDs. But TID 11 is out in that River North area that we've been talking about. And TID 12, you can see much smaller geographical area. It's on the north side of Churchill Street. A few parcels there that we believe would need TIF assistance for potential redevelopment opportunities. The base value on that TID would be much less, but we'll get into that next week. And that's all I have.